Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this important event. I would like to invite Ambassador Bremberg, President Emeritus of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, to deliver welcome remarks. Ambassador?
Thank you, Milda. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon on a Friday afternoon heading into the weekend. My name is Andrew Bremberg, and I have the honor to serve now as President Emeritus of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Our new President and CEO, Eric Patterson, is unable to be here with us today, but I'm also thrilled that we can acknowledge and welcome Dr. Elizabeth Spalding, who is the chairman of the Victims of Communism Board of Trustees, and so glad you can join us today, Dr. Spalding. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation exists to preserve the memory of the evils of communism and oppose its expansion in the world today. We are also thrilled to have our founder, Dr. Lee Edwards, with us here today. His inspiration, more than 30 years ago, about the need to remember and memorialize all the victims of communism, led him to partner with Lev Dobryansky to educate members of Congress here in Washington about the importance of such an effort. And that is why, because of his efforts, this year we mark our 30th anniversary after we were authorized by a unanimous act of Congress to educate the Americans about the more than 100 million people killed by communism. VOC's first major milestone was to erect the Victims of Communism Memorial, the world's first memorial dedicated to every victim of communism across the globe. This memorial was modeled off of the goddess of democracy, a statue constructed by peaceful pro-democracy student protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989. It stands in sight of the US Capitol and was dedicated by President Bush on June 12, 2007, the 20th anniversary of President Reagan's Tear Down This Wall speech. And after decades of work, tireless work, and generous support from those who remember the evils of communism, VOC opened these doors, to this new museum in June of 2022. Our mission today continues to remind and educate Americans not only of the 100 million killed by communist regimes, but also the 1.5 billion people, 1/5 of the world's population, that still lives and suffers under communism today. In fact, our mission has never been more vital. Whether it is the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, a former KGB thug and dictator of a failed post-communist Russia, or the worsening human rights abuses and increased aggression by the CCP under General Secretary Xi Jinping, these challenges today cannot be understood without first understanding the dangers and evils of communism. Today, we are proud to host the first ever exhibit from the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights in Vilnius, Lithuania, to come to the United States. The title of the exhibit that we'll open is From the Soviet Red Flag to the Lithuanian Tricolor, 50 Years of the Struggle for Freedom. 34 years ago this week, on March 11th, the extraordinarily courageous Lithuanian people came together as a nation to declare the restoration of their independence from the grip of the Soviet Union. The consequences from the Kremlin could have been devastating. Yet the desire to be free was stronger than the fear for life itself. For all Lithuanians, this date is a symbol of resistance, preservation of innate human rights, and the rebirth of statehood. As we remember the unwavering Lithuanian fight for freedom under 50 years of Soviet occupation, we must not forget how important it is to preserve historic memory, to pass it on to future generations, and to continue the fight against tyranny today. And now we will hear from Her Excellency Audra Plepytė, Ambassador of the Republic of Lithuania to the United States. And we will then hear from the curator, Ramunė Driaučiūnaitė, from the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights. These remarks will be followed by a panel discussion focused on Lithuanian fight for freedom and its relations to the ongoing war in Ukraine today. That panel will be moderated by VOC's Director of Fellowships and Coalitions, Milda Mataciunaite, and we will then reveal the grand opening of the exhibition with a light reception to follow. Lastly, I would like to say a special word of thanks to our partners at the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania, of course, the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights, and the Lithuanian Embassy here in Washington for making this event and the exhibit that we are about to unveil possible. Thank you so much for coming here today, this afternoon.
Ambassador, thank you for this wonderful words. And I would have to say that I'm very happy that you are with us today. I know there's some changes in the directors of the museum, but I remember when I came almost 3 years ago, you were one of the first persons I met here. And since then, we had this very close collaboration on such important topic as communism and what is matters today. That is not, unfortunately, is not a past, but it's also present as well. And we have to ensure that it will not become the future as well. As you mentioned, Milda mentioned, I think this week on the March 11, we celebrated the Day of Restoration of Lithuania's independence. That happened in 1990. After 50 years of Soviet occupation, Lithuanian people, Lithuanian government, and the whole population, all the Lithuanians, even we here on this side of Atlantic or in Lithuania, we restored our independence. We made this clear. And that happened after 50 years of the Soviet occupation. That is known for everyone probably, but it's not so much known what that meant for the Lithuanians as well. That Lithuanians fought guerrilla wars in Lithuanian forest for decades after the Second World War. They already knew what that means, the Soviet occupation. That means tortures, killing, deportation of everyone, including children, elderly, women, or men. So they knew that they had to fight. That resistance was successful in that sense that they raised their voice. They showed the voice of population that you have to resist. You have to fight for your freedom. It was not successful in that sense that it was oppressed. And many young men mostly, but also women died, were betrayed, killed, and that. So the best part. It's less also known that resistance didn't end with that. There were people who dedicated their lives in bringing news from closed, occupied Lithuania about how people are suppressed, but what they think to the free world. And we are, those who were behind the Iron Curtain, were so and still are very grateful for all you in America and other free world who amplified that voice for us and for the rest, demanding, requesting freedom of our countries. I speak here for the whole Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia as well, and Lithuania, but also freedom from our people. And that was so important for everyone. I do remember always speak how my grandparents, I had a peek, to be very frank, to that exposition who would be just behind those doors. And there are a photo of radio, Latvian radio, think VEF, who was almost in every household. And almost in every household, the people already were every night trying to get Voice of America, Radio Free Europe to learn what's happening in real world. And when we knew that here people are demonstrating, that American government is saying something that they support our freedom and our demand for freedom, that was a big, big hope for us. Incredible. That gave us a hope that we would become one day free. So there was also resistance in every person. Silent is resistant. Maybe during the day they were teachers, they were even civil servants, they were workers, farmers. But when they were home, they taught children, and I was among those children, how was to live in independent Lithuania, how other people live, and how we supposed to live. So we had double life, and that was so important as well. That's why the 11th of March in 1990 happened, whenever we had at least the slightest opportunity to restore our independence. And that's why also that gave our opportunities to restart building our state, to strengthen that. And we grasped that possibility very quickly and really seized every opportunity to go back to the Western world. World which cherishes freedom, democratic values, human rights, rule of law, all these everyday values, that's which sometimes we forget how important are they. And today's war in Ukraine also reminds us that history unfortunately tends to repeat. So that's why I'm so grateful this museum for hosting the exposition about our path to independence during these 50 years of occupation, which I think it could be also lessons learned, also an educational for the rest of the world and this world, but it's the whole society, every society, to be frank, not to forget what is mean occupation, what is mean communism, and how we also have to resist. And that's why we are so supporting also Ukraine. That's because they are fighting for them, but also our freedoms. And thank you once again as well for this, I hope, very nice, interesting discussions we are going to have for those parting. And before that, I would like to give the floor to the director of the Occupation and Freedoms Fight Museum from Lithuania, Ramunė Driaučiūnaitė, who is one of the persons behind that this exposition and this event today happens. Thank you very much to you and all your team for taking everything working. I know it was very hard work, but I think it's really worthwhile to have that. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to present to the public of the United States of America the exhibition From the Soviet Red Flag to the Lithuanian Tricolor, 50 Years of Struggle for Freedom, prepared by employees of the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights and the Tuskulėnai Memorial Complex of the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania. The exhibition uses a historical timeline to present the 50-year-long Soviet occupation of Lithuania, which required enormous efforts by the Lithuanian people not to surrender, not to reconcile, to fight, to remind themselves and the world over and over again that we were an independent state and that we want to be one. We start the exhibition from 16th February 1918. The First World War was underway and Lithuania had declared its independence from the centuries of oppression by the Russian Empire. A period of more than 20 years of building and prosperity of a modern state began. But the occupation of 1940 put an end to all that. The Russian Empire was replaced by the communist-led Soviet Union. Immediately after the occupation, brutal repressions began: deportations, killings, imprisonment in prisons, and hard labor camps. The end of the Second World War didn't change anything for Lithuania and its people. It remained occupied. In 1944, the Lithuanian Partisan War started. After 5 years of bloody fighting, the movement for the fight for freedom of Lithuania was formed on February 1949, uniting all Lithuanian freedom fighters. The Declaration of 16 February 1949, adopted by the Council of the Movement for the Fight for Freedom of Lithuania, proclaimed that Lithuania should be an independent and democratic state. This declaration was a moral strength and did not allow to surrender. Meanwhile, repressions continued. Hundreds of freedom fighters perished in the forests of Lithuania, and repressed people were turned into cheap, loveless hard labor force in the vastness of Siberia and on the steppes of Kazakhstan. Today, we are all witnesses of cruel and unjust war in Ukraine. The entire Lithuanian nation stands together with Ukraine because Lithuanians and Ukrainians share a common historical experience, the tireless fight for freedom during the Stalinist repressions, as well as the repressions carried out by the Soviets, deportations, imprisonment in prisons and hard labor camps. And even here, behind the barbed wire of hard labor camps, Lithuanians and Ukrainians managed to resist. They were the main organizers of the uprisings in hard labor camps. After the uprising in Kengir, Kazakh SSR in 1954, which was crushed by the Soviet government with tanks, the decades-old Gulag system began to crumble. The will of the people and the tireless fight won. It won then, and it will win now. Meanwhile, in Lithuania from 1954, there was a shift to intensive uniment anti-Soviet resistance. The people of the occupied states were mobilized by the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Lithuania, the victim of self-immolation of Romas Kalanta, the Lithuanian Freedom League, the Lithuanian Revival Movement, and the Baltic Way. After 50 years of occupation, 11th March 1990 was the day of the restoration of Lithuanian independence. The struggle seemed to be over, but on 14th January 1991, Russian tanks were on the streets of Vilnius, killing 14 people. The real Freedom Day was 31st August 1993. That was the day that the Russian troops were withdrawn from the territory of the Lithuanian state. For 50 years, the system of the occupying regime has tried to create a Soviet Homo Sovieticus, men and submissive people intimidated by repressions. The exhibition shows how this was done through culture, education, religion, and everyday life full of political propaganda. The exhibition From the Soviet Red Flag to the Lithuanian Tricolor, 50 Years of Struggle for Freedom, is accompanied by a series of 9 artworks by the artist Henrikas Tsiparis entitled The Suffering of Lithuania. These artworks use the language of artistic symbols to show the loss of independence, the deportations, the partisan struggle, and the events of 13th of January. I thank all those who have made tremendous efforts to ensure that today an important historical period for Lithuania and its people is presented here at the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ramunė. Thank you, all the speakers. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, honorable guests, Dr. Spalding, Dr. Edwards, Ambassador Bremberg, my name is Milda Mataciunaite, and I'm VOC's Director of Fellowships and Coalitions. I'm also especially Lithuanian today. It is very nice to see all the familiar faces, friends, colleagues, Lithuanian community, and diplomatic community that I worked in my previous capacities, and greetings to distinguished guests and speakers. I think that it is a really distinct honor to moderate this discussion on Lithuania's fight for freedom and its relation to the ongoing war in Ukraine. This topic that we're about to explore and the exhibit that we're about to unveil is near and dear to my heart, professionally and personally. I think age 9 was one of my most memorable years of my life. At 9, I learned about the meaning of freedom. I learned about the meaning of democracy. I learned to not be afraid, to show up at school without the red star with Lenin on my uniform. I learned to wear a Lithuanian flag on my chest without fear. I learned hundreds of Lithuanian freedom songs sitting on my dad's shoulders, standing hand in hand with brave Lithuanians, protecting the parliament building, hearing the chilling sound of Soviet army tanks rolling by. I learned to love and appreciate my language, my culture, my history that much more, my wonderful country that had so little yet so much to offer at that time. I didn't cry nor complain when Kremlin imposed a blockade on Lithuania to punish and suppress the rebellion, when we had no heat or hot water or no water at all and had to bring it in buckets from random outdoor facilities and heat it up with do-it-yourself means. I felt resolute when right after the March 11th, Soviet tanks drove around our neighborhood, announcing curfew hour and urging citizens to stay in and avoid rallies in town. My parents, just like every freedom-seeking Lithuanian, did not comply and bravely marched towards the TV tower, parliament building, media establishments, to protect the strategic buildings from the potential coup by Soviet government. People came in droves. No one was afraid, zero fear, and unwavering courage, because Lithuanians know the taste of freedom, and every one of them was ready to lay their lives instead of facing captivity again. Lithuanians know how oppression feels, and that is why they're fighting so staunchly for Ukrainian freedom. With that, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists. Viktor Nakas, we agreed for the American-speaking audience that I will address you as Viktor, was the Washington branch manager of the Brooklyn-based Lithuanian Information Center from 1987 to 1991. During those years, he served as a liaison for Lithuanian leaders during their visits to Washington. He was the interpreter for the Lithuanian Prime Minister and President at their meetings with President George H.W. Bush. He provided interviews to numerous print and electronic media outlets as an expert on Lithuania. Following the restoration of Lithuania's independence, he served as the political and press officer at the Embassy of Lithuania in Washington, D.C. from 1991 to 1993. He subsequently worked for 19 years at the Catholic University of America as a senior administrator, retiring in 2019. And with that, I'm going to start with Viktor. And I would like to hear, we've already discussed before this panel, your impressions and personal reflections during that time and the impact of Lithuanian Information Center. If you could tell the audience those lessons learned and your personal story, we would like to hear that and move forward to Michael and Shelby.
So should I deal with some of the talking points that I've prepared? Or...
Yes, please.
Okay. Perhaps I can deal with my personal story.
during the Q&A. What I really wanted to focus on in my introductory remarks was to make some observations about Lithuania's fight for freedom in 1990, 1991, and Ukraine's current war with Russia. The differences between the two cases are profound and more numerous than the similarities. I suggest that Ukraine's position today is in multiple ways considerably stronger than Lithuania's was in 1990. And yet, during these two time periods in question, Ukraine's citizens have paid a far higher price than Lithuania's citizens did. So let's begin with some contrasts and a few similarities. The backdrops, or the settings, in those two periods. In 1990 Europe, the arc of history was bending toward justice. Warsaw Pact nations were becoming free. The Cold War was ending. The USSR was experiencing severe systemic problems, especially in the economic sphere. Optimism and at times euphoria spread across European capitals. 2022 saw the arc of history bend toward tyranny. A new war, hot for Ukraine, cold for the rest of Europe, breaks out. Anxiety and grim discussions about security sweep across the continent. In March 1990, as we've already heard several times, Lithuania declared that it was restoring its national independence after more than 4 decades of Soviet occupation of its territory. And though Lithuania was to achieve international recognition of its statehood in fall 1991, it took an additional 2 years for all Soviet troops to leave. Today, a free and internationally recognized Ukraine is fighting to protect its independence and to repel Russian troops who occupy 18% of its territory. When Lithuania declared independence in 1990, public support in the United States was tepid. 2 polls conducted the month after the declaration in April illustrated that. When respondents were asked in an NBC Wall Street Journal poll to choose between Gorbachev and Lithuanian independence, 60% favored Gorbachev. A Time magazine CNN poll showed that 2/3 of respondents did not see Lithuania's fight for independence as a significant concern for the US, and only 1/4 agreed that the United States should pressure the USSR on Lithuania's behalf. By contrast, US public support for Ukraine has been much more robust. A Pew Research poll conducted in late January this year revealed that 2 years after Russia's invasion, 74% of Americans view the war as important to US national interests. Lithuania's struggle for independence enjoyed broad bipartisan support in Congress, within limits. While a US Senate resolution in March to recognize Lithuania immediately was defeated, less than 2 months later, the Senate voted to withhold trade benefits from Moscow until it halted its economic embargo against Lithuania and began negotiations. In 1990 and in 1991, President George Bush felt intense bipartisan pressure from Congress to be more supportive of Lithuania. As for Ukraine, what began as overwhelming support in Congress has declined over time, and thanks to hyperpolarization and growing isolationism among members of one party. Neither of those was a factor in 1990. In 1990, President Bush was a lukewarm supporter of Baltic independence. He prioritized Gorbachev's survival, German reunification, and the liberation of Kuwait over Lithuania's freedom. President Joe Biden is a firm supporter of Ukraine's efforts to survive the war and remain free. Although, and this is an important caveat, he has slow-walked the delivery of missiles, tanks, and planes that critics argue would give Ukraine the advantage it needs to decisively defeat Russia. In 1990, the White House had no grand strategy to deal with Baltic independence. If the current White House has a grand strategy with respect to the Ukraine-Russia war, it hasn't shared it with the public. In 1990 and even into the latter quarter of 1991, the White House did not foresee nor favor the disintegration of the USSR. It is an open question whether the Biden administration favors the complete and utter defeat of Russia by Ukraine because of the instability that it might cause in the ethnically diverse Russian Federation, which comprises numerous republics, regions, and territories. Both in 1990 and 2024, a key tenet of U.S. policy vis-a-vis the USSR and now Russia has been to safeguard nuclear weapons that fall under the purview of the Kremlin. Then as now, for U.S. policymakers, breakup of the Russian Federation raises the specter of unsecured nuclear arms being dispersed to multiple potentially malign actors. In 1990 and 1991, Lithuania's fight for independence elicited support from Russia's Western-oriented elite. When the Kremlin attempted to overthrow Lithuania's government in January 1991, massacring civilians at the Vilnius TV tower in the process, 100,000 Russians surged into the streets of Moscow to condemn Gorbachev and his government. Boris Yeltsin's active support was critical for turning the tide in favor of Baltic independence. In 2024, Russian citizens who support Ukraine are in jail or have fled to the West. Putin's obsessive ahistorical mythologizing about Ukraine as an integral part of the Russian nation sadly appears to enjoy widespread and deep support among Russian citizens. Mikhail Gorbachev suffered, and Vladimir Putin suffers from self-defeating delusions that have had deadly consequences. To preserve the USSR, Gorbachev was willing to sanction the murder of non-Russian inhabitants, but only in small numbers. Thus, in Lithuania, fewer than 25 citizens sacrificed their lives defending its freedom. Vladimir Putin is a mass murderer who is sanguine about obliterating thousands of Ukrainian civilians and tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, not to mention sacrificing even larger numbers of his own citizens to a war of attrition, all in the cause of recreating the Russian Empire. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Victor. I will now introduce Michael Sawkiw, Jr., Executive Vice President for Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and Director of a Ukrainian National Information Service. Mr. Sawkiw's efforts and key goal at the Ukrainian Congress Committee has been to ensure unity among America's European allies, challenge Russia by freezing assets of 4 banks that were sanctioned by the Biden administration, and continued efforts to revoke Russia's admission in SWIFT. Mr. Sawkiw has a long-standing professional expertise in nonprofit organizations, policy analysis, politics, government, and strategy planning. He was an associate in AIG Financial Products from 1993 to 1996. Mr. Sawkiw has a master's degree in Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the Lally School of Management, Corporate Finance, and International Business. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Milda. Good afternoon, everyone, esteemed ambassadors. Ladies and gentlemen, it's truly an honor to have been asked and to have this opportunity to speak to you and to give you some parallels as well, commenting on what Victor had just mentioned in his opening remarks about Lithuania's fight for freedom as well as Ukraine's fight for freedom. Lithuania has been very fortunate that its freedom truly was ensconced in 1991 after the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, and if anything else like that, for the past 20 years being within the NATO alliance. I am truly thankful to the Lithuanian nation because on March 11th, which is Lithuania's restoration of independence of 1990, but fast forward 34 years to March 11th of 2024. And in the major city centers throughout Lithuania were unfurled Ukrainian flags. That act of support, that act of camaraderie, not just helps in terms of the resilience of the Ukrainian people, but also is a show of force for the entire world that what is happening in Ukraine is not just unjust, it is truly a war crime. And if anything else like that, I would mention that it is genocide. But the parallels of what happened in Lithuania in March of 1990 also had its instances within Ukraine specific, but in other parts of the world as well. In March of 1990, Ukraine had its quote unquote parliamentary elections to its Soviet Socialist Republic parliament. It did not go very well. Students protested. And by October of that particular year, what was called the Revolution on Granite, Revolucja na Graniti. Students set up their tent cities, hunger strikes, human chains. What many of you know in the past revolutions of Ukraine of 2004 and 2013 and 14, what is called the Maidan, Kyiv's center city, back then had a massive statue of granite of Vladimir Lenin. That's why it was called the Revolution on Granite, because this was an opportunity to topple not just the granite physically, what was in Kyiv's main square, but also the realities of what it meant as a philosophy, what it meant as a government, and obviously what it meant in terms of the disastrous nature of suppression of the Ukrainian people. That parallel is not just unique within the former Soviet Union, in particular in Ukraine. Fast forward within several generations, and you had today, as a matter of fact, is the 13th anniversary of the Syrian civil uprising against the dictator. These dictators are not just in their own nebulous world. These are all coordinated activities of various regimes throughout the world. We must understand that this is not a one-off of what is happening right now in Ukraine. For what is happening in Ukraine has its roots throughout Ukrainian history and in the battle of Russian imperialism. The famous and infamous type of quote that you hear about Russian imperialism is that for the past 400 years, for 4 centuries, every single day, the territory of the Russian Empire increased by 50 square kilometers. That mentality of 400 years exists and remains today within the walls of the Kremlin. So this war in Ukraine right now is not just a war about Ukraine. This, if anything else like that, is a war of justice. This is a war for all freedom-loving people. And this is also a sign. Madam Ambassador, in her opening remarks, had mentioned about listening to the radio. Listening to the radio and having hope, in particular, coming from Washington, D.C., as the leader of the free world, that yes, there are people that are still thinking about those that are suppressed, those that have their rights taken away from them for whatever particular reason, whether it be religion, whether it be nationality, whether it be individuality. But unfortunately, that type of resistance coming here from Washington, D.C., again, as the leader of the free world, can be emanated right now back to Ukraine in 2020, from 2022, as being a new center of resistance for the entire world. I look at the truly remarkable and at times ultra-heroic understanding of the Ukrainian people of what they are facing. They are facing not just a tyrant and its machine, that machine of tanks, that machine of ammunition. It's more than just the kinetic forces associated with this war. There's a borderless war that is also going on, and that borderless war is disinformation. For those of you that might remember, my predecessor had opened by talking about Gorbachev. For those of you that might remember Gorbachev's trip to Washington, D.C. in 1990 to meet President Bush, traveling down Connecticut Avenue, not too far from this very location, jumping out of his motorcade to interact with the average American citizen on Connecticut Avenue. The most famous quote from that scene, that scenario, if I might add, came from a woman. He said that Gorbachev is a PR genius. Ladies and gentlemen, that PR genius was nothing more than disinformation. That PR genius is nothing more than exactly what is happening right now. Today being the 13th day of the Syrian revolution, today being the start of Russia's quote unquote election for president of the Russian Federation. I'd like to end by talking about resilience. And I'd also like to present a notion of us moving forward in the future. Looking at the political will of the West in support of Ukraine for the past 2 years, but if anything, for the past 10 years, because we know that this war of attrition, this war of Russian hegemony, this war of Russian imperialism has been lasting since February of 2014 with the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, as well as the little green men that came into eastern Ukraine in Donetsk and Luhansk. That resilience of those particular people, back then, the world knew what was happening, yet not at the same onset of what we see right now as a full-scale invasion. I give to you that as today, these so-called elections are happening within the Russian Federation, the European Council President, Charles Michel, quoted today a congratulatory note to President Putin saying, "I would like to congratulate Vladimir Putin on his landslide victory in the elections starting today. No opposition, no freedom, no choices." I give to you, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what we need to focus on for the future. We need to focus on understanding what it means, not just communism, but authoritarianism throughout the world, and how together, much like the Lithuanians, much like the Ukrainians, fought back against a tyrant. We cannot be cautious. We must move forward and have the political will to do what is right, to do what is just. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And now we heard Lithuanian perspective, we heard thoughts on Ukraine, and would like to hear from Shelby Magid from American perspective. Shelby is the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. In this role, she oversees the center's programming and policy work on Ukraine and the wider region. Shelby leads the center's congressional relations and the Eurasia Congressional Fellowship Program, an annual nonpartisan program that aims to educate congressional staff on current events in Ukraine and the Eurasia region and engage staff with the Council's latest research. Prior to joining the Council, Shelby spent time at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, focused on democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. She was also at the International Federation for Human Rights office in The Hague, where she worked with the International Criminal Court and conducted research on human rights violations in Mexico and Syria. Shelby received her bachelor's degree from Brandeis University in International and Global Studies and holds a master's degree in international relations with a focus on security and international justice from Central European University. Shelby, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. He's a hard act to follow, but I'm with him a lot, so I was expecting that. Americans are not known for being great with history and for global affairs, so thank you for letting me come to this. I was inspired by some of the remarks earlier touching upon what we learned from our families, so I was not planning to say this, but I want to add, as I am so grateful to be here before opening this exhibit, I got interested in what I do, which is trying to look at war in the world and conflict and trying to help by listening to my grandparents. I'm a Jewish American from Eastern European descent, and I didn't always understand what I was being told or yelled at in Yiddish, but I tried to learn, and I learned at a young age that horrible things can happen in the world, and that I didn't understand that. And so history really made an impression on me. I went to museums as well. I listened, I read, and I decided to do those degrees, go out in the world and try to see what I could do. So thank you for keeping this history alive for Americans. We don't always learn it in school. Notice I did not say I learned that in school. So thank you for having this. Now, fast forward to where I am today. I work at the Atlantic Council, as you introduced, just down the street, and I do our Ukraine work primarily. I've been doing it since before the full-scale invasion for about 6 years, but it took on a new urgency since then. In my work, I have had the pleasure of working closely with Lithuanians, not only on my Ukraine work, but also on my Belarus work, which I want to mention. The Lithuanians have been an incredible ally for the Belarusian democratic forces. I have had the opportunity to go to Lithuania to visit friends and to do policy work trips, and history has been an important part of that too. I have learned a lot from the Lithuanians, and I point to Lithuania as a moral North Star. I think that morality has a place in foreign policy, and it also helps when it aligns with our security and national interests. And that's where we connect to Ukraine. So values have been touched upon, and I completely agree with everything said. The values of democracy, human rights, and freedom, Lithuanians learned the hard way. You value that. Michael, you said that Ukrainians are fighting for that still. This is where I come in with my work, where I try to explain to Americans, this is a shared fight. And you touched on so many of the points, but I want to share and maybe ask you to help amplify some of the points where I talk about Lithuania's history and see that it can resonate with Americans. I talk about Ukraine's security impacts us all. When we're looking at the war in Ukraine, it is the right thing to do. That's the morality aspect, to support Ukrainians, but it also is in our interests. When you look at history and when you listen to modern day Russia, you see that there's an appetite beyond what they're going for right now. They don't just want to attack Ukraine. We can listen to what is being said. And when I listen to Lithuanians, I know from that historical standpoint that you know that there is this risk and that the way to respond right now is militarily. Lithuania shows us that there is a neighborhood, not just with Russia, but also with Belarus, where there is this oppression and aggression. I also admire Lithuania being home to many activists, civil society leaders, and democratic warriors who have fled and are supported there. I point to this to Americans and say, they understand this. You hear that from your grandparents, but you also know now. In graduate school, I had a friend who a lot of people thought was silly. To be honest, he's Lithuanian and he had volunteered for the army. And we went to the baths in Budapest and he put ice on himself. And we said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "We learned that you never know. It might be the winter when the Russians come." And everyone laughed. And he said, I'm not joking. This really could happen." I talked to him after February 2022 and he said, "See what I was saying? That is a sort of laughable story, but it's serious. We as Americans and others didn't have that perspective and he did." So I value that. I want to talk about the museums as well. In my congressional relations, I've had the opportunity to take congressional staffers, Democrats, Republicans from the House and the Senate. I used to take them to Ukraine. We took them to Kyiv and Kharkiv and actually out to the Donbass. Then there was COVID and we had to pause our trips. And then there was the full-scale invasion. And I had to think, what do we do now to still focus on Ukraine and show people the importance of Ukraine and their fight against Russia? So we went to Lithuania. We went to Lithuania and Poland, and I had great help from the embassy here, and we had incredible meetings. Part of that was hearing from politicians on what they said was the threat, what the security assessment was. But what I learned, despite the amazing meetings we had, and thank you, Marius, for helping set some of those up, was that a Lithuanian friend told me, you're not just going to learn what you need to know from the meetings. You need to go to the museums and you need to listen to people. So we took staffers, and it was a big group. We barely fit, but we went to the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights. I imagine many of you in this room, and I know certainly some are very familiar with the museum, and it teaches about the Lithuanian view towards Russia. We walked around the museum knowing that some of the horrors that we heard about were happening that very day in Ukraine. And learning about the repression and the history, I had listened to what some of those staffers said to me. They said that day, I had no idea it was so many people. I didn't know they went after kids. I didn't know this was such a big deal. Now I understand why the Lithuanians are so upset. And they were really shocked. I heard about it months later, and they said that going to the museum and learning that history put into perspective everything they heard in the meetings of why Lithuania was so supportive of Ukraine, why Lithuania had the view they had of Russia, and how history impacts them. So thank you for that museum. Thank you for helping me take Americans to Lithuania, and thank you for helping us get educated. Lithuanians, we know, are determined to invest in their own security, to value democracy and freedom, but it connects to Americans too, and that's what I emphasize. I am grateful for opportunities like this to say that we can talk about why Ukraine matters, but we also have to talk about why Lithuania matters, why it matters to the US. We're in NATO. Michael and I hear a lot on Congress, this is expensive. And then we say, now imagine if Russia went into other Baltic countries, into NATO. Imagine how it impacts us. So one last thing, as I'm listening to some of the troubling rhetoric in DC, where I also think that Lithuania's history could be useful, I think that there's increasing discussions about negotiating and what an end to the war could look like and negotiating with Russia. Everyone here in this room knows that history is important and the Lithuanian perspective is critical. And so we need to continue to support Ukraine so that they're in a position as strong as possible. I think there needs to be a military defeat of Russia, but also we can't just trust Russia at their word and what they say. And so that's where Lithuanians coming in and other allies and saying, we know, we've seen, we fight, we're investing. I think that is important now and it'll be more important going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shelby. I know that everybody's anxious to move on and see the exhibit, but before I turn to Q&A, I just have one question for each speaker, because each of you touched upon it, that each of you and all of us here were on the same page. We fight the good fight. We try to convince the Americans and the world outside of Ukraine and Lithuania that this matters, not just to Lithuania, not just to Ukraine, not just to those societies that are being attacked currently, but it should matter to the entire free world, because this is the fight of ideology, of concept of freedom. How can we better do this job? How can we better convey to the believers or to those who don't see much relevance in what we do from each of your perspective? And feel free to be creative how you answer this, and then we'll turn to Q&A. Thank you.
Well, I think, the most important thing is to be firm in your own beliefs, decide what you believe in, and then to press that point as much as you can, and to recognize that sometimes the conditions just aren't going to be favorable to do so. Let me give you an example. In 1975, the USSR, the countries of Europe, and the United States signed the Helsinki Final Act, which the Soviet Union very much wanted because they wanted recognition of the borders after World War II, which they hadn't received yet. And in exchange, they agreed to respect human rights. And Baltic Americans were very concerned about the recognition of the post-World War II borders, because they were afraid that would affect the US's policy of not recognizing the incorporation of the Baltic states into the USSR. But they did see an opportunity with respect to human rights. And they started to press on that issue. And they found that the US Congress was very receptive to that. So for Baltic Americans, it wasn't that the end game had changed. We all still wanted the Baltic states to become free and independent countries. But we had to use the tools at hand and in the environment in which we operate. To talk to lobby for political independence, to make that demand, would be futile, because politicians, I'm talking about people who occupied the White House, the media, thought that was ridiculous, that was not going to happen. So we started to press on the human rights issue. And when I was in my early 20s, a group of us came up with an idea to organize a rally at the Lincoln Memorial called the Baltic Human Rights Rally. Notice we weren't using the word independence, human rights rally. And we got 4,000 people to show up, which was one of the largest gatherings of diaspora Balts in those decades. And so we continue to press on that. When I went to work for the Lithuanian Information Center, we were part of a religious-based organization, Lithuanian Catholic Religious Aid, and our goal was to help the Catholic Church in Lithuania, which was 90% of the population before World War II was Catholic, and they were very heavily oppressed. And so we pushed on this issue of religious rights and human rights, and we found terrific resonance within the US Congress for those efforts. And then when Glasnost and Perestroika started and things started to open up, and Lithuanian citizens found that they could go and express themselves freely and start to organize rallies and so forth, our movement towards human rights morphed into, one of the greatest human rights, which is to be completely independent, to be politically free. And so we transitioned into that. So I don't have any suggestion for what we can do today. I just think we all understand. I think Ukrainians, Lithuanians understand that you take the long view of history, and when the opportunity presents itself, you push your agenda as aggressively as you can.
Thank you, Victor. That's exactly what I wanted to hear from you. Michael, what are your thoughts on that? In addition to what you were going to, how you were going to respond in terms of using that angle of, making the case for human rights, religious freedom versus coming forward with, geopolitical requests.
I thank you for the question, and I'd like to take a different spin on an answer coming again from my perspective here. First off, I think it's absolutely positively it's necessary for us to what I keep saying here in Washington, at least for the past 2 years, to quote unquote define the enemy. If we don't have a strategic objective in terms of defining who the enemy is, much of the policies of said free world in support of not just for Ukraine. Again, I'm speaking here as a Ukrainian American. Obviously, my objective is for a complete and total victory in Ukraine, borders of 1991, UN established, and so forth and so on. But we also have to look what is happening in the context of the rest of the world as well. So let's not cower when it comes to rhetoric. Let's not be fearful when it comes to false narratives coming from the Kremlin and coming from other capitals of tyrannical regimes as well. Our saving grace here in the United States and in other countries of the free world is your voice, your vote. We are 8 months from a national election in the United States. I'm not talking about today's elections in Russia or this weekend's elections in Russia. We know, like Charles Michel had mentioned, we know who the victor is going to be there. We don't know who the victor is going to be here in Washington, D.C. We did not know who the victor was going to be in KU for several rounds of presidential elections, or in Lithuania or other countries of the former Warsaw Pact. But what we do know is that democracy prevails. We do know that democratic principles and those values need to prevail for those subjugated countries right now that are still looking to Washington and to other parts of the world for support. Whether it's North Korea, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, Syria, Cuba, the list goes on and on and on, and obviously emanating as well from the Kremlin. So for us to be as enthusiastic about what we can do It's as simple as calling your congressman. It's as simple as calling your senator. It's as simple as relaying a message that what matters, what happens in Ukraine matters here in the United States. Because as Shelby had mentioned earlier, God forbid that there is an inch of territory that Putin wishes, or the Russian Federation wishes to take of a NATO country. And Russia is surrounded by NATO countries, in particular now from Finland through the Baltics, through a Black Sea neighbor of Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth. We must be cognizant of this, that we should not fear of what we can do, but what we have to do is to have the political will to make sure that we're defining the enemy and have a strategic goal for us as the United States to once again be a true global leader.
Thank you, Michael. Shelby, what are your thoughts about defining strategically the enemy, common enemy from American perspective?
I completely agree with Michael on defining this and having a strategy, bringing in that threat to American interests. I work for a former US ambassador, and he always says, we care about Ukraine, that's our job, but we have to talk about what matters to the US. It can be cynical, but when we're talking about really large amounts of money too, you have to explain to the American people why it matters. I've been told, well, don't you care about homeless people? Okay, yes, I do care. The money comes from different pots, actually. And often the people that are saying that, I'm not sure that's really their priority. But I say, you can care about two things. There are issues, there are reasons here. Michael talks about bringing in the geopolitical. We're finding that China is a big reason to talk about it. But going back to your original question on how to better convey this, I don't think that there's one answer and one perfect response. Otherwise, we would have already had it. I do believe that it matters to talk to as many people as possible and find what might be relevant to them. My sister, I love her. She is in California and she does not care about politics, not one bit. Even though I'm her sister and I could talk her ear off it, she did not seem bothered by the war in Ukraine. She did not understand why I was paying attention to it so much until I told her about Russia taking all these Ukrainian kids, kidnapping them and taking them to Russia, and then bombing schools and preschools. And then she also heard it from Mila Kunis. And then she said, that's not okay. And she called her congressman. I don't mean to just make fun of my sister. I actually think that it is an important reason to say that there's something for everyone. You can talk about art being looted. You can talk about the security aspects. There's something that will resonate with different people. I talked to a Marine last week and he said, my friends don't care about Ukraine, but I said, do you want me to have to go fight in Poland? And they said, no. And he said, so that meant they felt it was okay. So if there was a perfect answer, Michael would have said it earlier, others would be saying it, but I think continue to see what will connect with people. That's my answer.
Thank you, Shelby. Terrific. Thank you so much. So in the interest of time, we'll collect all the questions because I was told and instructed by my colleague Colleen that we need to wrap it up by 4:25. So if we have any questions in the audience. Gentleman in the back row. If you could please stand up, introduce yourself and ask the question. Thank you.
I'm John Gizzi, White House correspondent and senior political reporter for Newsmax. Some years ago, in fact, I believe it was 2018, I interviewed Madame Ambassador's predecessor, Mr. Pavlonis, and now a member of the Lithuanian parliament. He spoke at the time of the kidnapping of the Belarusian journalist and his girlfriend and the way they were treated. He said, Belarus is as bad a country as Russia at this point, and it shares a 60-mile border with Lithuania. And he said, if you are going to have peace in that part of the world, Putin has to go and Lukashenko has to go. Do you agree with that?
Who is this question addressed to?
Anyone
Anybody?
in the panel?
Yes.
Question right here in the front row.
And hello, I got here a little bit late, but even in that limited time, I heard at least two of your panelists mention China, and wanted to hear your thoughts on the notion that this what seems like a contradiction or a tension that's expressed when President Biden called China or the Chinese communist leader Xi Jinping a dictator. And when President Biden's Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, was asked this question, he said, the president spoke for all of us. So the Chinese president is a dictator, and yet United States is openly doing business with China. A lot of official back and forth, and recently what some analysts are calling sort of normalizing relations since they say the San Francisco summit, etc. So how do we Americans feel, how do you all feel about the United States literally doing business with dictators? I mean, that troubles me personally. For my job, just to be full disclosure, I'm a foreign affairs correspondent at Voice of America. Thank you all.
Thank you. Anybody would like to take this easy question?
The answer actually is that what is not happening right now when it comes to Russia. For 2 years, the Ukrainians and the world have looked to freezing and seizing Russian sovereign assets throughout the world. In the United States, there's about 6 to 7 billion of Russian sovereign assets. And in other parts of the world, the remaining of the 300 billion. In particular, one country called Belgium, which holds over 200 billion. The aspect of doing business with a corrupt regime, with a dictatorship, they need to feel it, not so much in the political will, which we all have spoken about in terms of values and democracy and democratic principles. They need to feel it, frankly speaking, ladies and gentlemen, in their pocketbooks. And if the average Russian citizen knows that this is going to be of detriment to them, of what their government is doing, that is an opportunity for whatever malaise can happen within said country. The same thing can happen for China as well. I think that this is a good example, as a matter of fact, as we are going through the process right now of trying to freeze and seize these assets of $300 billion. Should this happen, and happen in an expedited type manner, this could be a wonderful signal to those dictators throughout the world that should you choose to do something similar of acts of aggression against your neighbors, or in particular, even of what you're doing internally, domestically with your own people, this could sway them not to do those types of actions. And therefore, I call upon the United States, I call upon other world capitals to quickly expedite the freezing and seizing of assets. That, I think, would be a wonderful sign for other dictators and regimes throughout the world.
I want to add to that briefly. I'm glad you asked this about China, because I also want to say, as we're talking about oppression, to think of the Uyghurs as well. And I don't think they're mentioned enough in DC. I'm going to point to a different part of your question on the contradiction. When we talk about US support for Ukraine and looking at the threat of Russia, we often face the question of, well, what about China? Don't we need to prioritize China? And we're told that that's a contradiction. I believe that America should be able to do both, though we have seen weaknesses in our own productions and we need to address that. But that is something that we need to wake up to. China also learns from Russia. China is watching the US reaction to Ukraine. So a contradiction would be, if we think that China is the threat, turning away from Ukraine and just focusing on China. So that's something I like to point out to US policymakers as well.
Thank you, Shelby. We have one last question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, Tobias, and basically involved in international trade, but prior to that, had 34 years with U.S. Treasury. My question will be short, and this doesn't quite respond to your question completely, but I can never remember if it was Franklin Roosevelt or Winston Churchill who said, Stalin's a bastard, but he's my bastard at the moment. There are times you make deals with the devil, and that's just the reality of the world. Now, putting that aside, if Mr. Putin is knocked out of office in some way, I don't suggest to know the way, what would be the vacuum that would be filled? How would the vacuum be filled? If he disappeared from the face of the earth, metaphorically, what would be the power structure in the Russian Federation? Thank you.
Anyone would like to take this question?
I'll take a crack at this at a response to your question. I take a bit of umbrage, however, with your comment of deals with the devil. As a Ukrainian American, I take offense to that because in the room next door where this exhibit is to be opened, no more than 4 months ago, we had an exhibit to the Ukrainian Holodomor, the famine genocide, Stalin's famine genocide of 1932-33, in which between 7 to 10 million people were killed on the edict of a dictator. It's unfortunate that what you said in terms of having to deal with these types of devils, looking at the current political landscape within Russia right now, given, let's come up with what's the percentage point. I think there should be bets in in Las Vegas as to what percentage points that Putin wins on this particular election. Is it going to be 60? Will it be 70? Do I hear 80? And unfortunately, that type of mindset of what is happening right now within the greater Russian Federation, if the Russian people themselves don't have that courage of what the Lithuanians did and what the Ukrainians did and what others have done, then I think we're going to be seeing another generation of Putins come along, another generation of Stalins come along. And that is the very unfortunate fact of the situation, the current situation and debacle which is happening in the Russian Federation.
So if I might, I apologize. I offended you. That's not my intention. But I think the question still remains, if Mr. Putin were not there for whatever reason, what filled that?
Victor, please go ahead.
I think that's what makes U.S. policymakers very nervous, because they don't know. You can only speculate, right? I mean, they talk about some of Putin's close advisors, some of them who are said to be even crazier than he is, frankly. And so you just don't know in that vacuum who's going to take charge. And that's why there is this speculation, an argument by some, that they're giving Ukraine, the U.S. is giving Ukraine enough aid in order to kind of push the Russians back, perhaps regain all of its territory or some of its territory, but they don't want the collapse of the Russian Federation because of the fear that they don't want the absolute defeat of Russia by Ukraine, because of the fear that it would cause so much disruption in Russia that Putin could be overthrown and you could have, a chaotic situation. And always, I think, for U.S. policymakers is the fear of nukes. It was the fear in 91, and I suspect it's the fear today. So I honestly don't know who can answer your question. I think if you went over to the White House, I don't think they'd be able to tell you either.
I'll just add quickly. I won't dismiss it, because it is fair to wonder what will happen with leadership in Russia. But I have heard for the past 2 years in some conversations, and I'm not saying that is your way of putting it, some people fear Russia losing more than they fear Ukraine losing. And I think that is very misguided. And I think it's very convenient for Putin and the Kremlin as well. And so I would just flip it on its head. As for who will replace Putin, I'm not going to take that bet. I think he's here for a bit. But I would just think about, I see the fear of Ukraine losing as much more significant for us.
It was this very interesting discussion, so I also have to intervene. And since we are talking today how history learns us, or we learn from history, I do remember in 1990s, when Lithuania declared independence, how many leaders from the Western Europe or from Western world saying, please don't put this declaration on the table. What happens if Soviet Union collapses? What happens with nuclear weapons? That would be a disaster for the world. And that was not. That was, at least some countries got freedom and had really good path for that. So that's why I think we shouldn't even put the questions for ourselves, what happens? We just have to be strong for our values already, I think, and what we didn't talk about accountability as well. Because we witness crimes of aggression, war crimes or something like that. I think that's why we have also war in Ukraine, because we didn't have accountability or when the time was or something. But thank you very much for all this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And with that, let's give another round of applause to our speakers. But before we unveil the exhibit, the Lithuanian delegation has a special presentation of Freedom Fighter Award to Mr. Nakas, followed by Dr. Edwards. Ramunė, Aurelia.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening already. On behalf of the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of the Lithuania, we would like to present Mr. Viktoras Nakas this Freedom Fighters Award for your long-lasting, purposeful activity raising the issue of the occupied states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, defending human rights that were suppressed by the Soviet regime for half of a century, and mobilizing people for active civic actions that had a political impact here in America and help us to preserve hope in our countries. Thank you very much.
And the Freedom Fighter Award to Dr. Lee Edwards.
So, it is an honor for us to give this award for Dr. Lee Edwards, founding chairman of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, for his vision, seeing this museum as a point that would unite us to speak the truth and to preserve history and allow fostering democracy values and also make awareness about the crimes of communism.
Slava Ukraine.
And two very short token of appreciations for our ambassador, Mrs. Audra Plepytė, for being our voice of cultural democracy and helping us to foster this remembrance here in the Americas. Last but not least, we would like to give a present for Dr. Elizabeth Edward Spalding, who was working with us and helped us enormously to open this exhibition.
Thanks, everybody. And now is the time for Ambassador Bremberg to open the exhibit.
Thank you all for coming again this afternoon on a Friday. Welcome again to those who've been here before. This is why you come back again, even if you've come before, because there are new exhibits. And those of you for whom this has been a first visit, thank you for coming and tell your friends about it. So with that, we will open the exhibit. Thank you, everyone.